Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. The GPS died exactly 1 mile before we found hell. I never believed in the stories they told about the Ouachita Mountains until what happened to me out there. My name is Michael Williams, I'm 34 years old, and what I lived through during that weekend still wakes me up at night. It started as a simple RV trip. My wife Sarah and I had been planning it for months. We'd bought a used Winnebago from a dealer in Little Rock, spent weekends fixing her up, painting over the rust spots, replacing the worn upholstery. Sarah had sewn new curtains, hung little plants in the windows. We called her Wanderer, and she was going to be our escape from everything. My job at the insurance company, Sarah's endless night shifts at the hospital, the suffocating routine that had been strangling us for years. The plan was simple: drive deep into the Arkansas wilderness, find a secluded spot near Lake Ouachita, and spend 4 days completely disconnected. No cell service, no internet, no responsibilities. Just us, the woods, and a chance to remember why we'd fallen in love 12 years ago. We left Little Rock on a Thursday morning in September, the Winnebago loaded with supplies for a week. Sarah had made sandwiches, packed enough canned goods to survive a nuclear winter, and filled a cooler with beer and her famous potato salad. I'd brought my fishing gear, a stack of paperback thrillers, and a bottle of bourbon I'd been saving for a special occasion. The drive through Hot Springs was beautiful. Rolling hills covered in the first hints of autumn color, clear skies, perfect weather. Sarah had her feet up on the dashboard, singing along to some country song on the radio, her blonde hair catching the sunlight. For the first time in months, I felt genuinely happy, hopeful even. "Turn left at the next mile marker," Sarah said, consulting the paper map we'd bought at a gas station. She'd insisted on doing this old school. No GPS, no smartphones. Just us and the open road, the way people used to travel. The road started to narrow as we climbed into the mountains. Thick pine forests pressed in on both sides, broken occasionally by glimpses of distant ridges. We passed a few scattered cabins, a boarded-up general store, an old church with broken windows and a leaning cross. The kinds of places that made you wonder who still lived out here and why. "This is perfect," Sarah said, squeezing my hand. "Miles from anywhere." That should have been our first warning. We'd been driving the back roads for about 2 hours when we came to the turnoff. A dirt road marked only by a weathered sign that read, "Forest Service Road 447, 7 miles to lake access." The road looked rough, but the Winnebago was built for this kind of thing. We'd researched dispersed camping areas, knew that some of the best spots required a little off-road adventure. "You sure about this?" I asked, feeling the RV rock as we hit the first pothole. "Come on, Mike. When did you become such a worrier?" Sarah laughed and leaned over to kiss my cheek. "Besides, look at those trees. It's like driving into a fairy tale." She was right. The forest was beautiful in a wild, primordial way. Ancient oaks and towering pines created a canopy so thick that the afternoon light came down in scattered golden beams. Ferns carpeted the forest floor, and occasionally we'd catch glimpses of deer bounding through the underbrush. The road got progressively worse as we climbed deeper into the mountains. What had started as gravel became rutted dirt, then barely more than 2 muddy tracks. Tree branches scraped against the sides of the RV, and more than once I had to stop to move a fallen log out of our path. "Maybe we should turn around," I suggested after bottoming out in a particularly deep rut that made the dishes rattle in the cabinets. "We've come this far," Sarah said. "Besides, look." She pointed ahead to where the trees seemed to thin out. "I think we're almost there." 5 minutes later, we emerged into a clearing that took our breath away. A pristine lake stretched out before us, maybe a 1/4 mile across, surrounded by steep wooded hills. The water was so still it looked like black glass, perfectly reflecting the pine trees and the cloudless sky above. A small dock extended about 20 feet into the water, its weathered boards gray with age. "This is it," Sarah whispered. "This is perfect." I had to agree. It was like something from a postcard, completely isolated, breathtakingly beautiful. I couldn't believe we'd found such a perfect spot without even trying. We spent the next hour setting up camp. I leveled the RV using the hydraulic jacks while Sarah unrolled our outdoor carpet and set up the folding chairs. The silence was complete except for the gentle lap of water against the shore and the whisper of wind in the pine needles. No traffic, no neighbors, no civilization at all, just the two of us and the wilderness. As evening approached, I built a fire in the stone ring we found near the dock. Someone had been here before, but not recently. The ashes were cold and scattered with leaves. Sarah opened a bottle of wine, and we sat by the lake watching the sun sink behind the mountains, painting the water gold and red. "I could stay here forever," Sarah said, curled up against me in one of the camp chairs. "Me too," I said, and meant it. For the first time in years, I felt completely relaxed. The stress of work, of bills, of all our accumulated disappointments seemed as distant as the lights of Little Rock. We made love that night in the RV's tiny bedroom, with the windows open to let in the cool mountain air. Afterward, we lay tangled in the sheets, listening to the night sounds. Owls calling, branches creaking, the distant splash of what might have been a beaver or large fish jumping. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked around midnight. "Hear what?" I thought I heard singing. I listened, but heard only the wind and water. "Just the wind, babe. Go back to sleep." But now that she'd mentioned it, I found myself lying awake, straining to hear. There was something in the sound of the wind through the trees, a quality that was almost musical, almost human, like voices singing in harmony, too distant to make out the words. I must have dozed eventually because I woke to Sarah shaking my shoulder. Pale morning light was seeping through the curtains. "Mike," she whispered urgently, "there's someone outside." I sat up, instantly alert. Through the thin walls of the RV, I could hear footsteps. Slow, deliberate, circling the vehicle. The steady crunch of leaves and twigs under boots. "Stay here," I whispered, reaching for the baseball bat I'd stowed under the bed. "I'll check it out." "No." Sarah grabbed my arm. What if it's someone dangerous?" The footsteps stopped. We held our breath, listening. 30 seconds passed. A minute. Nothing. Then, very gently, someone knocked on our door. 3 soft raps, almost polite. "Hello," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. No answer. But after a moment, the knocking came again. 3 raps, identical to the first. I looked at Sarah. Her face was pale, eyes wide with fear. "Don't open it," she mouthed. But I was already moving toward the front of the RV, baseball bat in hand. Whatever was out there, I needed to know what we were dealing with. Through the small window in the door, I could see a figure standing about 10 feet away. Tall, wearing dark clothes, face hidden in shadow. "Can I help you?" I called through the door. The figure didn't respond, didn't move. It just stood there, perfectly still, as if waiting for something. I was about to say something else when Sarah screamed behind me. I spun around to find her pressed against the back wall of the RV, staring at the rear window. "There's another one," she whispered. I looked where she was pointing and felt my blood turn to ice. Another figure stood at the back window. Same height, same dark clothing, same unnaturally still posture. As I watched, it raised one hand and pressed it against the glass, leaving a smudge of what looked like mud or blood. "We need to get out of here," Sarah said, her voice rising toward panic. "Now." I nodded, already moving toward the driver's seat. But when I looked out the windshield, my heart nearly stopped. There were more of them. At least 6 figures standing in a rough circle around our RV, all perfectly still, all facing us. "Mike?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "What do they want?" I didn't answer because I didn't know, and because I just realized something that made my mouth go dry with terror. None of the figures had faces. Where their features should have been, there was only smooth, pale skin. I turned the key in the ignition and the engine turned over on the first try. Thank God. The figures didn't move as I put the RV in reverse and began backing away from the lake, but I could see their heads turning to follow our movement. "Hurry," Sarah urged. gripping the dashboard so hard her knuckles were white. I spun the wheel and pointed us back toward the dirt road. In the side mirror, I could see the figures still standing motionless in the clearing, watching us leave. But as we reached the tree line, something made me glance back one more time. They were all raising their hands now, pressing them against invisible barriers as if they were trapped behind glass. And for just a moment, before the trees blocked my view, I could have sworn I heard that singing again, closer now and heartbreakingly beautiful. The road seemed different in daylight, narrower, more overgrown. Branches that I didn't remember scraped against the roof of the RV, and I had to slow to a crawl to navigate around fallen logs that definitely hadn't been there the day before. "How long until we reach the main road?" Sarah asked. She'd been silent for the past 20 minutes, staring out the passenger window at the dense forest. "Should be any minute now," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I felt a growing unease. We'd been driving for almost an hour, and nothing looked familiar. The road seemed to be taking us deeper into the mountains instead of back toward civilization. Then I saw something that made me slam on the brakes. Ahead of us, carved into a massive oak tree that blocked most of the road, were symbols. Not letters or numbers, but strange geometric shapes that hurt to look at directly. They seemed to writhe and shift when I wasn't looking straight at them, like they were alive. "What is that?" Sarah whispered. Before I could answer, she screamed. A face had appeared in the passenger window, one of the faceless figures from the lake, pressed up against the glass. This close, I could see that where its eyes should have been were just smooth depressions in pale flesh. Its mouth was a lipless slit that opened and closed soundlessly like a fish gasping for air. I gunned the engine, swerving around the marked tree. The figure fell away from the window, but in the mirror I could see it climbing to its feet, unhurt. More of them were emerging from the forest now, dozens of them, all turning to watch us pass. "What are they?" Sarah sobbed. "What do they want?" I didn't have an answer. All I could do was drive, following the winding dirt road as it led us deeper into a forest that no longer looked like any place on Earth. The trees were wrong now. Too tall, too thick, with bark that looked almost scaled. The shadows between them were too dark, and sometimes I glimpsed things moving in that darkness that didn't look like any animal I'd ever seen. The road forked ahead, splitting into two equally unfamiliar paths. I chose the one that seemed to head downhill, hoping it would lead us back to lower elevations and eventually to civilization. But after another 20 minutes of driving, we came to another fork, and another. "We're lost," I said finally, pulling over in a small clearing. "I don't recognize any of this." Sarah pulled out the paper map, spreading it across her lap. She studied it for several minutes, her frown deepening. "This doesn't make sense," she said finally. "According to this, we should have hit Highway 270 15 minutes ago. But there's no highway here. There's nothing here." I looked at the map over her shoulder. She was right. The area we'd driven through showed numerous roads, towns, even a state park. But we hadn't seen any of those things. It was as if we'd somehow driven off the edge of the known world. "Maybe the map is wrong," I suggested, though I didn't believe it myself. "Government survey maps aren't wrong, Mike." Sarah's voice was tight with barely controlled panic. "Something is very, very wrong here." As if to emphasize her point, the sun chose that moment to disappear. Not behind clouds, there weren't any clouds, but simply fade away, as if someone had turned down a dimmer switch. In the space of about 30 seconds, afternoon became twilight, became full dark. "That's impossible," Sarah breathed. "It's only 2 o'clock. I looked at my watch, and my blood went cold. The hands were spinning wildly, clockwise, then counterclockwise, as if time itself had lost all meaning. That's when we heard the singing again. It came from all around us, dozens of voices raised in perfect, haunting harmony. The melody was beautiful and terrible at once, seeming to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my bones. Sarah pressed her hands over her ears, but I found myself leaning forward, straining to make out words that weren't quite English, weren't quite human. "Drive!" Sarah screamed, her voice barely audible over the chorus. "Please, just drive." I floored the accelerator, and the RV lurched forward into the unnatural night. The singing followed us, growing louder and more complex. New voices joined the chorus, children's voices, high and sweet and wrong. The sound seemed to be coming from the forest itself, from every tree and shadow. Then the engine died. We coasted to a stop in the middle of the dirt road, surrounded by darkness so complete that our headlights seemed to make no impression on it at all. I turned the key, but nothing happened. No click, no cough of the starter trying to turn over. Nothing. "The generator's dead too," Sarah said, flicking the light switch. "Everything's dead." We sat in the suffocating darkness, listening to the singing that now seemed to be coming from directly above us, as if a choir of angels, or demons, was perched on the roof of our RV. "Look," Sarah whispered. I followed her gaze through the windshield and felt my sanity take another step toward the edge. Lights were approaching through the forest, dozens of them, moving between the trees in perfect synchronization. Not flashlights or lanterns, but a cold, bluish glow that seemed to emanate from the figures themselves. The faceless ones were coming for us. "We have to run," I said, grabbing Sarah's hand. "Now." "Run where? We don't even know where we are." "Anywhere but here." I yanked open the RV door and we stumbled out into the night. The air was wrong, too thick, tasting of copper and decay. The singing was louder now, seeming to come from the very ground beneath our feet. "This way," I said, pulling Sarah toward what I hoped was a gap between two of the approaching lights. We crashed through the underbrush, branches tearing at our clothes and skin. Behind us, I could hear the RV door slamming open and closed, as if something was searching through our belongings. We ran blindly through the forest, guided only by adrenaline and terror. Twice Sarah fell, and twice I hauled her back to her feet. The lights seemed to be everywhere now. Ahead of us, behind us, on all sides. But somehow we kept finding gaps, kept running through spaces that should have been blocked. It wasn't until we'd been running for what felt like hours that I realized the truth. They were hurting us. We stumbled into another clearing, both of us gasping and exhausted. In the center of the space stood a structure that made my mind recoil. Not quite a building, not quite a natural formation, but something in between. It was made of what looked like woven branches and pale stones, rising about 30 feet into the air in a twisted spiral that hurt to look at. "What is that?" Sarah panted. Before I could answer, the singing stopped. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the music had been. It pressed against my eardrums like a physical weight, broken only by the sound of our labored breathing and the distant drip of water. Then, from somewhere inside the structure, came a new sound. A baby crying. "Oh God," Sarah whispered. "There's a baby in there." She started toward the structure before I could stop her. The maternal instinct that made her such a good nurse overrode every survival instinct she possessed. "Sarah, no!" I lunged after her, but she was already at the entrance, a low archway that seemed to exhale cold air and the smell of wet earth. "Hello," she called softly. "Is someone in there? We can help." The crying got louder, more insistent. It was coming from somewhere deeper in the structure, down what looked like a spiraling passage that curved out of sight. "We have to help," Sarah said, looking back at me with tears in her eyes. "It's just a baby, Mike. How can we leave a baby out here?" I knew it was a trap. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to grab Sarah and run, but the crying was so pitiful, so genuinely distressing that even I found myself wavering. "Please," Sarah begged. "We'll just look. If something's wrong, we'll leave immediately." Against every shred of common sense I possessed, I nodded. The passage sloped downward, the walls pressing closer as we descended. Our footsteps echoed strangely in the confined space, creating harmonics that sounded almost like whispers. The baby's cries grew louder, echoing off the walls until it was hard to tell which direction they were coming from. The passage opened into a circular chamber about 20 feet across, and there, in the exact center, was the source of the crying. It was a baby, or something that had once been a baby. It lay in a crude cradle made of woven branches, its tiny fists waving in the air. but its skin was the color of old parchment. And when it opened its mouth to cry, I could see too many teeth, rows and rows of tiny sharp teeth like a shark's. "Oh my God!" Sarah gasped, stumbling backward into me. The thing that looked like a baby turned its head toward us, and I saw its eyes, ancient, intelligent, filled with a malevolent hunger that belonged in no infant face. It stopped crying and smiled, and that smile was the most terrifying thing I'd ever seen. "Thank you for coming," it said in a voice like grinding stone. "We've been waiting so long for new friends." The walls of the chamber began to move, contracting like the throat of some enormous beast. The entrance we'd come through was sealing itself, the opening growing smaller with each passing second. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Sarah's hand and diving for the shrinking exit. We squeezed through just as it snapped shut behind us, the walls making a wet, organic sound as they closed. Behind us, the thing in the cradle began to laugh, a sound like breaking glass mixed with the screams of dying animals. We raced back up the spiraling passage, no longer caring about stealth or silence. All that mattered was getting out, getting away from this place that existed outside the normal laws of reality. We burst out of the structure and kept running, crashing through the forest without any thought of direction. Branches whipped across our faces, roots caught our feet, but we didn't slow down. Couldn't slow down. Because behind us the structure was coming apart, unraveling like a spider's web in a hurricane, and from the ruins came sounds that no human throat could make. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs gave out, finally collapsing beside what looked like a small stream. In the faint starlight, I could see Sarah's face, pale, streaked with tears and dirt, her eyes wide with shock. "What was that thing?" she gasped. "That wasn't human. That wasn't—" "I don't know," I said, though I was beginning to have a horrible suspicion. The symbols on the tree, the faceless figures, the impossible geography. It all pointed to something my rational mind refused to accept. We'd driven into somewhere that wasn't quite part of our world, a place where different rules applied, where things that should have been myth and nightmare walked freely under impossible stars. "We have to find the RV," I said. "It's our only way out." "What if it won't start? What if those things—" "Then we fix it. We do whatever we have to do to get out of here." The journey back to the RV took 3 hours by my watch. Though time seemed meaningless here, we followed the stream until it led us to a familiar-looking dirt road, then followed that until we found our vehicle sitting exactly where we'd left it. The faceless figures were gone, but they'd left signs of their presence. Muddy handprints covered every window, and the door hung open, moving gently in the breeze. Our belongings were scattered around the clearing, clothes, food, camping gear, as if something had gone through everything we owned, looking for something specific. "What were they searching for?" Sarah whispered. I shook my head, stepping carefully over our scattered possessions to reach the driver's door. The keys were still in the ignition where I'd left them. I held my breath and turned them. Nothing, not even a click. "The battery," I said, popping the hood. Maybe they disconnected the battery. But when I looked under the hood, my blood turned to ice. The battery was there, and all the connections looked normal. But every piece of metal, the engine block, the alternator, the battery terminals, was covered in the same strange symbols we'd seen carved into the tree. "They're burned in," Sarah said, running her finger over one of the symbols on the radiator, like they were branded. I tried the ignition again, and this time I got a response, but not the one I wanted. The engine coughed to life, but instead of the steady rumble of a healthy motor, it made sounds that didn't belong in any machine. Grinding, scraping, almost organic sounds, as if something alive was trapped in the engine block. But it was running. Whatever those things had done to our RV, it was still mobile. "Get in," I told Sarah. "We're leaving. Now." She didn't argue. We climbed into the cab and I put the vehicle in drive, following the dirt road back the way we'd come. The engine continued to make its disturbing noises, and every few minutes one of the gauges would spike into the red zone before dropping back to normal. But we were moving, putting distance between us and that horrible clearing with its impossible structure and its thing that wore the shape of a baby. The road seemed different again, shorter somehow, as if the forest was eager to be rid of us. Within an hour, we saw the first encouraging sign: a rusty mailbox beside a driveway that led to a small cabin. Then another cabin and another. Signs of human habitation in a world that had begun to follow recognizable rules again. "There," Sarah said, pointing ahead to where the dirt road intersected with honest-to-God asphalt. Highway 270. We made it. But as I turned onto the paved road, I glanced back one more time at the forest we were leaving behind. For just a moment, I could have sworn I saw them. Dozens of pale figures standing just inside the tree line, watching us go. Not following, just watching. And that singing started up again, so faint I might have imagined it. We drove straight through the night, not stopping until we reached Little Rock. Sarah called in sick to work, and I took a personal day. We spent the rest of the week trying to convince ourselves that what we'd experienced had been some kind of shared hallucination. Maybe carbon monoxide poisoning from the RV's heating system, or some kind of toxic plant spores in the mountain air. But the evidence was harder to ignore. Every piece of metal in the RV bore those burned-in symbols, and no amount of scrubbing or grinding could remove them. The engine continued to make sounds that no mechanic could explain, though it ran normally enough to get us home. Strangest of all was what we found when we developed the roll of film from Sarah's camera. Most of the pictures were normal, shots of the scenery during our drive, photos of each other setting up camp. But the last few frames showed things that made my skin crawl. There was a photo of our campsite taken from inside the forest, showing Sarah and me sitting by the fire, unaware that we were being watched. Another showed the interior of the RV at night, taken from outside through a window, both of us clearly visible sleeping in the bed. And the final photo, taken from an impossible angle high above the trees, showed our RV in the clearing surrounded by dozens of pale figures. At first glance, they looked like the faceless ones we'd encountered. But when I examined the photo with a magnifying glass, I realized the horrible truth. They all had faces, human faces. The faces of people who had probably driven into those mountains just as we had, looking for a peaceful weekend in the wilderness. People who had found something else entirely and never made it home. We sold the RV the following week to a dealer in Hot Springs, taking a massive loss just to get rid of it. I told him about the engine problems, recommended he have a mechanic look at it before reselling. But I didn't tell him about the symbols or about where we'd been. Some knowledge is too dangerous to share. Sarah and I never went camping again. We tried a few times over the next couple of years, but every time we got more than an hour away from civilization, one of us would start to panic. The sight of deep forest, the sound of wind in pine trees, even the smell of wood smoke was enough to send us racing back to the safety of streetlights and traffic. Our marriage didn't survive. How could it? We'd shared an experience that was literally unspeakable, something that existed outside the boundaries of the world we thought we knew. The stress of keeping that secret, combined with the constant low-level fear that those things might someday decide to follow us home, slowly poisoned everything between us. Sarah moved to Phoenix after the divorce, as far from forests and mountains as she could get. I stayed in Little Rock, but I don't sleep well. Every night I lie awake listening to the sounds outside my window, wondering if that soft footstep I just heard was a neighbor's cat, or something else entirely. Because I've done research since then, spent countless hours in libraries and on the internet, looking for other stories like ours. And I've found them. Scattered accounts from all over the country of people who drove into wilderness areas and encountered things that shouldn't exist. Most of them are dismissed as hoaxes or delusions, filed away with Bigfoot sightings and alien abductions. But I know better. I know there are places in this world, thin places, where the boundaries between what is and what should never be have worn away. Places where the faceless ones wait patiently for the next carload of vacationers looking for a peaceful weekend in the woods. The worst part isn't what we saw in those mountains. The worst part is the knowledge that some of those people in the photograph, those missing campers and hikers whose faces I recognized from old newspaper articles, might still be alive in whatever dimension those creatures call home. Still alive, but no longer human. Sometimes, in the early hours of the morning when sleep finally comes, I dream about that baby thing in its cradle of woven branches. In the dreams, it's grown larger, more terrible, feeding on the life force of everyone who stumbles into its domain. And in these dreams, it's always smiling that horrible smile and speaking in its voice like grinding stone. Thank you for coming. We've been waiting so long for new friends. I wake from these dreams covered in cold sweat, with the sound of that impossible singing echoing in my ears. And every time, I have to check the locks on my doors and windows, because I can never quite shake the feeling that something followed us home after all. Something patient and hungry, waiting for the right moment to finish what it started in those dark mountains where time runs backward and the trees have too many teeth. The GPS died exactly 1 mile before we found hell. But hell, it seems, has a much longer reach than I ever imagined. Story 2. The gap was smaller than it had appeared from a distance. I had to turn sideways to squeeze through, feeling bark scraping against my back and chest. Marcus was right behind me, pushing against me in his desperation to escape, and then I was through, stumbling into the forest beyond the unnatural barrier. Marcus tumbled out after me, and we ran. The forest beyond the tree line was different. Older, darker, with thick undergrowth that caught at our clothes and roots that seemed designed to trip us. But it was natural forest, not the sterile perfection of our prison. We crashed through it like wounded animals, following what might have been a game trail toward where we hoped the main road lay. Behind us, the creatures had begun to sing again, but their melody was different now. Harsher, more urgent. Hunting music. "Don't look back," Marcus panted beside me. But I couldn't help myself. I glanced over my shoulder and saw them flowing through the forest like smoke, their pale forms weaving between the trees with impossible speed. They weren't running. They were gliding, their feet barely touching the ground. We ran harder, our lungs burning in the thin mountain air. Branches whipped across our faces, drawing blood. My ankle twisted on a hidden root, sending me sprawling, but Marcus hauled me upright and we kept going. The sound of running water reached us through the trees, a stream or creek that might lead to civilization. We altered course, following the sound through increasingly dense undergrowth. The creatures singing grew fainter behind us, or maybe that was just wishful thinking. We burst from the tree line onto a narrow dirt road, empty and overgrown but unmistakably human-made. To our right, the road disappeared into darkness around a bend. To our left, it climbed toward what looked like a pass between two peaks. "Which way?" Marcus gasped. I tried to orient myself to remember the route we'd taken to reach the campground, but nothing looked familiar. The landscape had shifted, become alien and threatening. "Up," I said, pointing left toward the pass. "Higher ground. We can see where we are." We jogged up the road, our supplies weighing heavy on our backs. Every few minutes, one of us would glance back toward the forest, expecting to see pale figures emerging from the shadows. But the tree line remained empty. The road switchbacked up the mountainside, and with each turn I felt a growing sense of unease. This wasn't the way we'd come. The campground had been in a valley, not on a mountain pass. Either we were hopelessly lost, or the geography itself had changed. Sarah. Marcus had stopped ahead of me, his face white with exhaustion and terror. "Look." I followed his gaze and felt my knees nearly buckle. In the distance, visible through a gap in the peaks, was our campground. The RV sat in its circle of relocated trees like a tiny white dot. But it was impossible. We'd been running for over an hour, had climbed hundreds of feet up the mountainside. The campground should have been miles away, invisible behind multiple ridges. Instead, it looked like we could reach it with a long stone's throw. "It's not real," Marcus whispered. "None of this is real." But the gravel beneath our feet felt real enough. The sweat stinging my eyes, the ache in my calves from the climb, all of it felt absolutely real. "We keep going," I said. "There has to be an end to this." The road crested the pass and began to descend the other side. For a moment, hope flared in my chest as I saw lights in the valley below. A town, or at least some kind of settlement. But as we got closer, I realized the lights were wrong. They flickered and danced like fireflies, but they were too large, too bright, and they were moving in patterns that hurt to follow with the naked eye. "We can't go down there," Marcus said. I knew he was right. Whatever was waiting in that valley, it wasn't help. It was another trap, another impossibility designed to break our minds. So, what do we do? Marcus was quiet for a long time, staring down at the dancing lights. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm with the kind of acceptance that comes after despair. "I think we have to go back. Back to the campground. To those things. I think that's what they want. For us to run. To exhaust ourselves. To drive ourselves crazy trying to escape from something that can't be escaped." I wanted to argue, to insist that there had to be another way. But as I looked around at the alien landscape, mountains in the wrong places, roads that led nowhere, lights that moved like living things, I realized he might be right. "What do they want from us?" I asked again. "I don't think they want to hurt us," Marcus said slowly, working through the thought. "They want to understand us, to become us. Maybe if we stop running, if we face them." He didn't finish the sentence, but I understood. Maybe if we stopped being prey, they'd stop being predators. The walk back down the mountain was the longest of my life. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to hide, to fight. But I forced myself to walk slowly, deliberately, back toward the thing that terrified me most. The campground looked different in the afternoon light. The circle of trees seemed less threatening, more like a natural grove. The RV sat peacefully in the center, our belongings scattered around it where we'd dropped them in our panic. And standing beside it, waiting for us, was a single figure. It was taller than the others, more human in its proportions, but its skin held that same translucent quality. As we approached, it raised one hand in what might have been greeting. "You came back," it said, and this time it used its own voice instead of imitating ours. The sound was like wind through leaves, musical but alien. "What do you want from us?" I asked for the third time. "To learn," it replied. "Your kind passes through our realm so rarely. Usually they flee and we learn nothing. But you chose to return." "What's your realm?" Marcus asked. The creature gestured around us, taking in the forest, the mountains, the impossible geography. "This place between, where your world touches ours. We have been here since before your kind walked upright, watching, learning, trying to understand. And the others, the ones that look like us? Learning, as I said. They try to copy your forms, your sounds, your patterns of thought. But they are crude copies. They lack understanding." I thought of the pale faces in the trees, the perfect mimicry that had been just wrong enough to horrify rather than fool. "What do you really want?" I pressed. The creature was quiet for a long moment, and when it spoke again, there was something almost sad in its voice. "We want to know what it feels like to be you, to love, to fear, to hope, to know that your existence is brief and fragile. We are eternal, unchanging. We do not understand why your kind fights so hard to preserve something so temporary, because it's all we have," Marcus said quietly. "Yes," the creature agreed. "That is what we wish to understand, what it means to have everything depend on such a small flame of consciousness." I looked around at the other creatures that had begun emerging from the trees. They no longer seemed threatening, just curious, like children watching adults perform some incomprehensible ritual. "If we help you understand," I said, "will you let us go?" "We will not keep you," the creature replied. "But understanding, that may require sacrifice." "What kind of sacrifice?" The creature stepped closer and I caught that scent again. Organic, green, like fresh earth after rain. "One of you must stay, must teach us directly what it means to be human. The other may go, may return to your world and live out their brief, bright existence." Marcus and I looked at each other. I saw my own thoughts reflected in his eyes. This was the choice we'd been running from all along. Not the choice of whether to leave the forest, but which of us would pay the price for our freedom. "How long?" Marcus asked. "Until we understand. Until we have learned what we need to know. It could be days. It could be forever. I'll stay, Marcus said immediately. No, I said. I will. Sarah, I'm the one who wanted this trip. I'm the one who picked this place. This is my fault. That's not how it works, Marcus said, and for the first time in months his voice held all the love that had gotten buried under work stress and marriage counseling. We're in this together. The creature watched our argument with what might have been fascination. You would both sacrifice yourselves for the other. Of course, I said. Of course, Marcus echoed. This is what we wish to understand, the creature said softly. This willingness to suffer for another. We have observed it in your kind, but we do not feel it ourselves. The other creatures had formed a loose circle around us, all watching with those two wide eyes, but they no longer seemed hostile. If anything, they looked almost reverent, as if they were witnessing something sacred. There may be another way, the creature said slowly, if you are both willing to share the experience, to let us understand through both of you, briefly, before you return to your world. What does that mean? I asked. We touch your minds. We experience what you experience, feel what you feel, for both of you, together. But the process, it may change you. You may not return as the same people who entered our realm. Marcus and I looked at each other again. After everything we'd been through, after the months of fighting and therapy and sleeping in separate rooms, the idea of change didn't seem so terrible. What do you think? He asked. I took his hand, feeling the calluses from his weekend woodworking projects, the small scar on his thumb from where he'd cut himself fixing our kitchen sink. All the tiny, mundane details that made him real, that made him mine. I think, I said, that maybe change is what we need. The process wasn't painful, exactly, but it was overwhelming. The creatures surrounded us, their long-fingered hands touching our heads, our shoulders, our hearts. I felt their minds pressing against mine, alien and vast and hungry for understanding. They experienced our memories, not just the recent terror, but everything. Our first meeting at a coffee shop near campus, our first fight over something stupid and forgotten, the day we'd gotten engaged, the night we'd almost filed for divorce, every moment of joy and pain and mundane routine that made up the architecture of our shared life. But more than that, they experienced the love itself, the complex, difficult, sometimes painful emotion that bound us together despite everything. I felt their wonder at it, their struggle to comprehend something so irrational and powerful. And through their alien perspective, I began to understand it differently myself. Not as the desperate clinging I'd sometimes thought it was, but as a choice we made over and over again. The choice to see value in something fragile, to fight for something that would inevitably end. When it was over, Marcus and I found ourselves lying in the grass beside the RV, the circle of creatures nowhere to be seen. The forest around us looked normal again, the trees in their proper places. Story 3. The dead don't stay buried in Utah. I'm Sarah Martinez. I was 34 when we drove into Goblin Valley State Park in our RV that October, and I learned that some places are graveyards disguised as playgrounds. The CB radio crackled to life as we pulled off Highway 24, the static resolving into a voice that made my skin crawl. Welcome to the Valley of the Goblins, travelers. Hope you brought your appetites. My husband Jake laughed from the driver's seat of our Winnebago, adjusting the CB's volume. Weird way to welcome tourists, but okay. He glanced at me through the rearview mirror where I sat cross-legged on the dinette bench. Sarah, did you hear that? I had heard it. The voice was wrong somehow. Too smooth, like honey poured over broken glass. But Jake was excited about this trip. Our first real vacation since his cancer went into remission 6 months ago. I wasn't going to ruin it with my paranoia. Probably just a local trying to be spooky for Halloween season, I said, though my fingers unconsciously traced the scar on my palm from the car accident 3 years ago, the one where I died for 47 seconds before the paramedics brought me back. Ever since then, I'd been sensitive to things that felt off. Our golden retriever, Copper, whined from his spot by the door, ears flattened against his head. He'd been agitated since we'd entered Utah 2 days ago, panting and pacing despite the cool October air. "Easy, boy," Jake called back. At 36, my husband looked healthier than he had in months, the hollow-cheeked specter of chemo finally fading. His dark hair was growing back thick, and there was color in his cheeks again. This trip was supposed to be our celebration. 3 weeks exploring Utah's national parks in the RV we'd bought secondhand but fixed up ourselves. The radio crackled again. "Channel 19 for updates, friends. Weather's turning tonight. Might want to settle in nice and cozy." Jake frowned at the cloudless sky visible through our windshield. "Weather looks fine to me." As we wound through the increasingly barren landscape, the familiar red rock formations of Utah gave way to something stranger. Towering sandstone hoodoos rose from the desert floor like frozen sentinels, their wind-carved features creating the illusion of faces in the stone. Goblin Valley State Park sprawled before us, a maze of bizarre geological formations that looked more like an alien planet than anything earthly. "Jesus," Jake breathed, pulling into the campground. "Pictures don't do this place justice." The campground was nearly empty, just a handful of RVs and tents scattered across the rocky terrain. Our assigned spot, number 13, sat at the edge of the camping area, closest to the valley floor where thousands of goblin-shaped rocks created a natural labyrinth. The nearest neighbors were a retired couple in a massive Class A motorhome, parked 3 spots down. As Jake maneuvered our Winnebago into position, I noticed something odd. Every other RV in the campground had their CB antennas extended, the thin metal whips swaying in the desert breeze. It seemed excessive for such a remote location, but maybe the isolation made people more reliant on radio communication. "I'm going to say hello to the neighbors," Jake said once we were parked and leveled. "Get the lay of the land." I watched through our window as he approached the couple's RV. They were sitting outside in lawn chairs, a man and woman in their 70s, both unnaturally pale despite the desert sun. The woman looked up as Jake approached, and even from a distance I could see her smile. It was too wide, stretched across her face like a wound. Copper pressed against my legs, trembling. Dogs knew things. I'd learned that the hard way. Jake returned 20 minutes later, his expression troubled. That was weird. "How so?" They kept asking if I'd heard the signal, clearly. When I mentioned the CB welcome message, they got really excited. Started talking about how the feast was going to be wonderful this year. He shook his head. "I think they're just eccentric old folks, but something felt off." I bit back the urge to say, "Asterisk, I told you so, asterisk." Instead, I helped him set up our awning and camp chairs while Copper paced restlessly around the RV's perimeter. The sun was setting behind the goblin formations, casting long shadows that seemed to shift and dance even when the wind was still. "Let's take a walk through the valley before it gets dark," Jake suggested. "Get some photos." The Valley of the Goblins spread out before us like a nightmare playground. Thousands of mushroom-shaped rock formations, some as tall as buildings, others small enough to climb on, created a maze of narrow passages and hidden alcoves. The formations had been carved by millions of years of wind and water erosion, but in the dying light they looked deliberately crafted, like monuments to some ancient, malevolent deity. We followed a well-worn trail into the heart of the valley, our footsteps echoing off the sandstone walls. Copper stayed close, his usual enthusiasm for exploration replaced by nervous energy. Every few minutes he'd stop and stare at one of the formations, hackles raised, a low growl rumbling in his throat. "What's got him spooked?" Jake wondered aloud. I was wondering the same thing. The silence in the valley was oppressive. No wind, no insects, no bird calls. Just the sound of our breathing and the crunch of sand beneath our feet. As we walked deeper into the labyrinth, I began to notice carved symbols on some of the rock faces. Not ancient petroglyphs, but fresh marks, angular and deliberate. "Jake," I called, pointing to a series of marks on a particularly large goblin. "Look at this." He examined the symbols, a mixture of straight lines and curves that seemed to form letters, though not in any alphabet I recognized. "Probably just kids goofing around," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. As we rounded a bend in the trail, we came upon a clearing where someone had arranged dozens of smaller rocks in concentric circles. At the center sat a cairn about 4 feet tall, its stones stacked with mathematical precision. Fresh offerings surrounded the base, wildflowers that shouldn't have been blooming in October, pieces of raw meat that should have been crawling with flies but weren't, and small animal bones arranged in intricate patterns. "We should head back," I said, the familiar chill of wrongness crawling up my spine. But Jake was already approaching the cairn, camera in hand. "This is incredible. Some kind of folk art installation." "Jake, don't—" He reached out and touched the topmost stone. The change was immediate. The oppressive silence shattered as wind began to howl through the formations, though I couldn't feel so much as a breeze on my skin. Copper barked frantically, spinning in circles as shadows seemed to detach from the goblin rocks and writhe like living things. And then it stopped. Complete silence returned as if someone had flipped a switch. Jake stared at his hand, then at me. "Did you hear that?" I had heard it. But more than that, I had felt it. A presence awakening, ancient and hungry, turning its attention toward us like a spotlight swiveling to illuminate prey. "We need to leave. Now." We hurried back through the maze of formations as darkness fell. The trail that had been cleared during our hike-in seemed different now. Paths that should have led back to the campground instead curved deeper into the valley. After 30 minutes of walking, we found ourselves at the same cairn we'd started from. "That's impossible," Jake muttered, checking his GPS. The device showed nothing but static. Copper was panting heavily despite the cool air, and when I knelt to comfort him, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. His shadow on the ground was wrong. While Copper sat beside me, his shadow was standing, head cocked, watching something I couldn't see. "Jake," I whispered. But when I looked up, my husband was gone. "Jake!" I called out, my voice echoing off the stone walls. "This isn't funny." Copper whined and pressed against me, still staring at something beyond my vision. I pulled out my phone, no signal of course, and used its flashlight to illuminate the area around the cairn. Fresh footprints in the sand, including Jake's distinctive hiking boots, but they didn't lead anywhere. They simply stopped, as if he'd been lifted into the air. The CB radio on my belt crackled to life. I'd forgotten I was carrying it. "Sarah?" Jake's voice, thin and distorted by static. "Sarah, where are you?" "Jake, where are you?" "I'm at the cairn." I'm back at the RV. How did I get here?" I remember touching the rock and then— "Sarah, something's wrong. The couple from the other RV, they're standing outside our door. They won't stop smiling." My heart hammered against my ribs. "I'm coming. Don't let them in." But as I tried to retrace our steps, every path seemed to lead me in circles. The goblin formations loomed larger in the darkness, their carved features seeming to shift and change when caught in my peripheral vision. After an hour of futile searching, I finally found a trail marker that pointed toward the campground. The scene that greeted me there defied explanation. Our RV sat exactly where we'd parked it, warm light spilling from its windows. Jake stood in the doorway talking to the elderly couple, all three of them smiling that same too-wide smile. But it was wrong. Everything was wrong. Jake's movements were too fluid, like a marionette guided by an expert puppeteer. The couple's shadows fell in impossible directions, and the RV itself seemed different, cleaner, newer, as if it had been replaced by a perfect replica. "Sarah!" Jake called out when he spotted me. "There you are. I was worried." I approached slowly, Copper growling at my side. "Jake, you said something was wrong. Over the radio." He tilted his head, that smile never wavering. "Radio? I haven't been on the radio. Where did you go? You just vanished." The elderly woman, who had introduced herself earlier as Dorothy, stepped forward. Her skin was paper-thin, veins visible like dark rivers beneath the surface. "Your husband was telling us about his recent recovery. Such a miracle, surviving cancer. But then, we all survive things, don't we, dear?" Her words hit me like a physical blow. We hadn't told anyone about Jake's cancer. He was private about it, almost secretive. There was no way he would have shared that information with strangers. How did you... The signal tells us many things, the elderly man, Dorothy's husband Frank, said. His voice was the same honey-over-glass tone from the CB welcome message. It whispers secrets in the night, shares stories of pain and loss and the desperate things people do to cling to life. Jake's smile faltered for just a moment, confusion flickering across his features. I don't... What signal? The one you answered when you touched the cairn, Dorothy said, her grin stretching impossibly wider. The one that's been calling to the desperate and dying for centuries. You felt it, didn't you? That moment of connection, that promise of more time. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Jake's miraculous recovery, his sudden interest in this remote Utah park he'd never mentioned before. The way he'd been drawn to that cairn like a moth to flame. You're not Jake, I whispered. The thing wearing my husband's face turned to look at me, and for just an instant its eyes were completely black. I am now, and you're going to help me stay that way. I ran. Copper and I fled into the maze of goblin formations, my flashlight beam dancing wildly across the sandstone walls. Behind us, I could hear voices calling. Jake's voice, Dorothy's voice, Frank's voice, and others I didn't recognize, all blending together into a harmonious chorus that seemed to come from the rocks themselves. Sarah, come back. We just want to talk. Don't be afraid, dear. The signal is beautiful once you stop fighting it. The feast requires all of us, Sarah. Don't spoil the gathering. I found a narrow crevice between two large formations and squeezed inside. Copper pressed against me. My phone was dead, the CB radio silent. We were trapped in a geological maze with things that wore human faces but weren't human at all. Hours passed. The voices continued their patient calling, sometimes close, sometimes distant, but never stopping. I dozed fitfully, jolting awake whenever Copper growled at sounds I couldn't hear. When dawn finally broke, the voices fell silent. I waited another hour before emerging from our hiding spot. The goblin formations looked innocent in the morning light, just weird rocks shaped by natural forces. But the wrongness remained, a psychic stench that made my teeth ache. The campground was empty. Not just deserted, empty, as if the RVs and tents had never existed. Even our Winnebago was gone, leaving only tire tracks in the sand that seemed to fade as I watched them. But the CB radio on my belt crackled to life. Sarah. Jake's voice, clear now, free of static. Sarah, if you can hear this, I need you to understand something. I died. The cancer took me 6 months ago in the hospital. I remember the light fading, the monitors going quiet. My legs gave out, and I collapsed onto the sand. But then I heard it. The signal. It promised me more time with you. All I had to do was bring you to the valley, feed you to the things that live in the rocks. It seemed like a fair trade at the time. Copper whined and nuzzled my face as tears streamed down my cheeks. I'm fighting it now, trying to break free, but I don't know how much time I have before it takes control again. You need to leave Utah. Get as far away as you can. And Sarah. A pause, filled with the kind of love that transcends death. I'm sorry. I love you. I've always loved you. The radio went silent. I don't know how I made it out of Goblin Valley. I remember walking, Copper at my side, following highway markers until a park ranger picked us up. I told him our RV had broken down and we'd become separated from my husband, who had gone for help. He was kind enough not to question why I was sobbing uncontrollably. The official report stated that no RV matching our description had been registered at the park. No record of Jake Martinez existed in their system. The elderly couple I described had never been seen by any staff member. But I found other reports, buried in internet forums and local newspaper archives. Stories going back decades about people who visited Goblin Valley and came back wrong. Spouses who claimed their partners had died years earlier. Children who insisted their parents were strangers wearing familiar faces. And always the CB radio broadcasts. welcoming messages that lured the desperate deeper into the valley where ancient things waited to trade borrowed time for fresh sustenance. I never found Jake's body. I never found our RV. But sometimes, late at night, I pick up CB chatter on Channel 19, voices calling out across the desert, welcoming new travelers to the Valley of the Goblins. And occasionally, I hear Jake's voice among them. The signal is still broadcasting, still seeking the desperate and dying, still promising more time to those willing to pay its price. Sometimes I wonder if I'm strong enough to resist its call. Because the truth is, I miss Jake so much that eternal servitude in a Utah rock garden seems like a fair trade for one more day in his arms, even if those arms no longer belong to him. The CB radio sits on my kitchen counter now, permanently tuned to Channel 19. Waiting, and every October when the desert wind blows just right, I hear it clearly. Welcome to the Valley of the Goblins, Sarah. Your table is waiting. I'm still in Colorado, still trying to decide whether to drive south. Copper died last winter. Cancer, the vet said, though he'd always been healthy before our Utah trip. Now I'm truly alone, and the signal is getting stronger. Asterisk, if you're reading this, don't go to Goblin Valley in October. Don't touch the cairns. And if someone you love comes back from the desert changed, remember, the dead don't stay buried in Utah. Asterisk, they just learned to smile. Story 4. The GPS started glitching 3 miles before we reached the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. My name is Marcus Webb. I'm 34 years old, and what happened during our RV trip still makes me check the locks twice before bed every night. Recalculating. The synthetic voice had been repeating itself for the past 10 minutes while Sarah drummed her fingers against the passenger seat armrest of our rental RV. Behind us, Jake and Melissa were playing cards at the dinette, their laughter a sharp contrast to the mounting tension in the cab. Maybe we should turn around, Sarah said, watching the pine trees grow thicker along the narrow Forest Service road. This doesn't feel right. I should have listened to her. Sarah had always been intuitive about these things. The way she'd suddenly refuse to enter certain buildings, or how she'd grip my arm when we passed strangers who looked perfectly normal to me. But I was stubborn, and we'd driven 4 hours from Portland to get here. The campground's just ahead, I said, though the truth was I hadn't seen a single road sign for the past 20 minutes. The GPS showed us as a blue dot floating in an ocean of green, no roads marked anywhere. Besides, Jake's been planning this weekend for months. Jake Chen was my business partner, and this trip was supposed to be a celebration. Our tech startup had just secured its second round of funding, and he'd insisted we needed to get back to nature before the real work began. He'd rented this massive Class A motorhome, a 40-foot beast with slide-outs and a satellite dish that cost more per day than my mortgage payment. "I found it," Melissa called from the back, her voice bright with artificial cheer. She'd been trying too hard to fit in all weekend, desperate to make a good impression on Jake's friends. They'd only been dating for 2 months. Pine Ridge Campground, elevation 3,200 feet. Says here it has full hookups and... Oh, her voice faltered. What? Sarah twisted around to look. It says seasonal closure October through March. But it's November. Jake leaned forward, peering over Melissa's shoulder at her phone. That's probably outdated. These websites never get updated. Trust me, I called them last week. I caught Sarah's eye in the rearview mirror. She was chewing her bottom lip, which she only did when she was really worried. But Jake was already launching into another story about his cousin's camping adventures, and Melissa was laughing at all the right moments, and the momentum of the group carried us forward down the increasingly narrow road. The trees pressed closer. Douglas firs and western hemlocks formed a cathedral ceiling above us, blocking out most of the afternoon light. Patches of snow appeared in the shadows between the massive trunks, even though the weather in Portland had been unseasonably warm. There, I said, pointing to a break in the trees ahead. That's got to be it. Pine Ridge Campground existed, technically. A weathered wooden sign hung askew from a single remaining chain, half the letters too faded to read. The entrance was nothing more than 2 concrete posts with a rusted metal barrier that had been pushed aside years ago. Beyond it, a gravel loop disappeared into the trees. "This place looks abandoned," Sarah said. "It's just rustic," Jake insisted, but I could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. "Come on, we've got everything we need in here. Generator, propane, full water tanks. We could camp in a parking lot if we had to." The campground had 12 sites arranged in a rough oval, each with a concrete picnic table and what had once been a fire ring. Tree branches had grown through the metal rings, lifting some completely off the ground and splitting others in half. The electrical pedestals were dark, their breaker boxes hanging open like gaping mouths. I pulled into Site 7, the only one where I could maneuver the RV without scraping tree branches. The moment I shut off the engine, the silence hit us like a physical weight. No bird songs, no wind through the trees, no distant traffic hum. Just an oppressive quiet that seemed to press against the windows. "Well," Jake said, clapping his hands together with forced enthusiasm, "let's get this party started." We spent the next hour setting up, extending the slide-outs, connecting the generator, arranging lawn chairs around a makeshift fire pit Jake built from stones he found scattered around the site. Melissa gathered firewood while Sarah unpacked groceries, both women working with the kind of focused intensity that meant they were trying not to think about where we were. The sun was setting by the time we got the fire going, painting the trees in shades of orange and red that should have been beautiful, but somehow felt ominous. I'd found a bottle of bourbon in the RV's cabinet, and we were all drinking more than we normally would, using alcohol to dull the edge of unease that none of us wanted to acknowledge. "So, what's the plan for tomorrow?" Melissa asked, settling into Jake's lap on his lawn chair. "Hiking? Fishing?" "There's supposed to be a lake about 2 miles north of here," Jake said, consulting the paper map he'd brought as backup when the GPS failed. "Mirror Lake. Great trout fishing, according to the guidebook." "Is it marked on the map?" Sarah asked. Jake frowned, tilting the map toward the firelight. "Well, not exactly, but the guidebook definitely mentioned it." "What guidebook?" I asked. HM. Jake's frown deepened. "You know, I can't remember where I put it. Must be somewhere in the RV." The fire popped, sending up a shower of sparks, and we all jumped. That's when I first heard it. A low electronic hum coming from somewhere beyond the tree line. It was barely audible, just at the edge of perception, like tinnitus or the sound of old fluorescent lights. "Anyone else hear that?" I asked. We all fell silent, listening. The humming continued for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped. "Probably just the generator," Jake said, though our generator was clearly visible 20 feet away, purring quietly to itself with a completely different sound. "Maybe there's cell service up here after all," Melissa said, pulling out her phone. "Could be a tower nearby." She frowned at her screen. "Weird. I've got 4 bars, but nothing's loading." We all checked our phones. Same thing. Full signal strength, but no data. Calls wouldn't connect, texts wouldn't send, and websites hung on loading screens indefinitely. "That's unusual," Sarah said. "Probably just network congestion," Jake said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Rural towers get overloaded easily." The humming started again, closer this time. It seemed to come from multiple directions at once, creating a disorienting stereo effect that made it impossible to pinpoint the source. This time it lasted almost a full minute before cutting off abruptly. "Okay, that's definitely not the generator," I said. "Could be a research station," Jake suggested. "The Forest Service does all kinds of monitoring out here. Air quality, wildlife tracking, that sort of thing." It was a reasonable explanation, and we all grabbed onto it gratefully. We spent the next hour talking about work, about the startup, about anything except the strange sounds in the woods. The bourbon helped, and soon we were laughing at Jake's impression of our stuffiest investor, the same guy who'd insisted on a synergistic value proposition for our user interface. But as the fire died down and the darkness pressed closer, the silences between our conversations grew longer. Every few minutes, one of us would glance toward the trees, listening for that humming sound. "I think I'm going to turn in," Melissa said around 10 o'clock. "Long day tomorrow." She kissed Jake goodnight and headed into the RV. Sarah stood up, brushing ashes off her jeans. "I'll be right behind you," she told me, then leaned down to whisper in my ear. "Something's wrong here, Marcus. I want to leave first thing in the morning." I caught her hand as she started toward the RV. "What kind of wrong?" She glanced around the campsite, then back at me. "It feels like we're being watched." After she went inside, Jake and I sat in uncomfortable silence, poking at the dying coals with sticks. The bourbon had worn off enough for sobriety to creep back in, bringing with it the full weight of our isolation. "She's right, you know," Jake said suddenly. "About what?" "About being watched. I keep seeing movement in my peripheral vision, shadows that don't match the trees. I'd been seeing the same things but hadn't wanted to admit it, dark shapes that seemed to shift and flow just beyond the reach of our firelight, always disappearing the moment you looked directly at them." "Probably just animals," I said. "Deer, maybe. Or elk." "Yeah, maybe." Jake stood up, stretching. "But I'm going to sleep with the doors locked tonight." I was about to respond when the humming started again. This time it was much louder, and it wasn't coming from the forest. It was coming from above. We both looked up. Through the gap in the canopy, I could see stars. More stars than should have been visible through the light pollution of the Pacific Northwest. But there was something else up there, too. A faint, pulsing glow that seemed to move in slow, deliberate patterns. "What the hell is that?" Jake whispered. The glow brightened for a moment, revealing what looked like geometric shapes, triangles and hexagons that shifted and reconfigured themselves against the star field. Then it faded, taking the humming with it. "Weather balloon," I said automatically, though I didn't believe it. "Marcus." Jake's voice was tight. "Weather balloons don't make geometric patterns." We stood there for another few minutes, necks craned toward the sky, but the lights didn't return. Eventually, Jake muttered something about getting some sleep and headed into the RV. I stayed outside long enough to scatter the coals and make sure the fire was completely out, all the while fighting the feeling that something was watching me from the darkness beyond our campsite. The RV felt cramped after the openness of the outdoors, but also reassuringly solid. Sarah was already asleep in the bedroom, curled up on her side with her back to me. I could hear Jake and Melissa talking in low voices from the convertible dinette bed, though I couldn't make out the words. I just started to drift off when Sarah's phone buzzed on the nightstand. She mumbled something and rolled over, reaching for it. In the glow of the screen, I saw her frown. "That's weird," she whispered. "What?" "Text from my sister. Says she's been trying to call me all day because of the news." "What news?" Sarah's thumb moved across the screen, then stopped. It won't load. The message just says, "About Pine Ridge," and then cuts off. A chill ran down my spine. When did she send it? 2 hours ago. Sarah showed me the timestamp. "But Marcus, my sister lives in Boston. She wouldn't know anything about where we are. Unless she'd been watching the news, I thought but didn't say. Unless something had happened here before, something bad enough to make the national news." "Probably just a coincidence," I said. But I was already reaching for my own phone. I had 17 missed calls. From my brother in Seattle, from our employees, from investors. All within the past 3 hours. None of the voicemails would play. "Jake," I called out, keeping my voice low. "You awake?" "Unfortunately, yes. You guys getting weird messages too?" "How many missed calls?" 23, plus about 40 texts that won't load." We all ended up gathering in the main living area, phones in hand, trying to make sense of the influx of communications that we couldn't actually access. It was clear that something was happening in the outside world, something that involved us or our location, but the partial signal that gave us bars without data meant we were completely cut off from information. "This is really starting to freak me out," Melissa said. She was sitting close to Jake, gripping his hand. "What if there's an emergency? What if someone's hurt?" "We'll head back first thing in the morning," I said, "but there's nothing we can do tonight." "Actually," Sarah said slowly, "there might be something we can do." She was looking out the window toward the forest. "That humming sound, if it really is some kind of research station, they might have communication equipment, or at least know what's going on." "You want to go wandering around in the woods at midnight?" Jake asked. "I want to find out why half the people we know are trying to reach us." She had a point, and sitting in the RV, cut off and helpless, was almost worse than facing whatever was out there in the dark. "If we do this, we stick together," I said. "Nobody goes off alone, and at the first sign of trouble, we come straight back." We suited up, jackets, flashlights, boots, and stepped back out into the night. The temperature had dropped at least 10 degrees since we'd gone inside, and our breath formed visible clouds in the beam of our flashlights. The silence was even more oppressive now, a thick blanket of quiet that seemed to muffle even our footsteps. "Which direction?" Jake asked. Before anyone could answer, the humming started again. This time we could tell it was coming from the north, deeper into the forest. We followed a game trail that led roughly in that direction, our flashlight beams dancing across moss-covered trees and fallen logs. The humming grew steadily louder as we walked, developing harmonics and overtones that suggested multiple sources. After about 10 minutes of hiking, we saw lights through the trees. Not the warm orange glow of campfires or the steady white beam of floodlights, but something cold and blue-green that pulsed in regular intervals. "There," Melissa whispered, pointing. We crept closer, using the trees for cover. What we found defied easy explanation. It was some kind of installation, a collection of metallic structures arranged in a perfect circle around a clearing about the size of a basketball court. The structures looked like a cross between radio telescopes and abstract sculptures, all curves and angles that hurt to look at directly. They hummed in alternating sequences, and each pulse of sound was accompanied by a corresponding pulse of that eerie blue-green light. "What is that thing?" Sarah breathed. "I have no idea," I whispered back. "But I don't think it belongs to the Forest Service." That's when we noticed the people. There were maybe a dozen of them standing motionless around the perimeter of the installation. At first glance, they looked like researchers or technicians. They wore dark clothing that could have been uniforms, and they stood at regular intervals like sentries. But something was wrong with the way they stood. Too straight, too still, like mannequins positioned for a window display. And when one of them turned his head to look in our direction, the movement was wrong too. Too smooth, too mechanical. "Run," Sarah whispered. We didn't need to be told twice. We crashed through the underbrush, no longer caring about stealth, our flashlight beams swinging wildly as we stumbled over roots and branches. Behind us, I could hear the sound of pursuit. Not the heavy breathing and crashing footsteps you'd expect from people chasing us through the forest, but something else. A rustling, sliding sound, like fabric being dragged across the ground. We burst into our campsite and dove into the RV, slamming the door and throwing the deadbolt. Jake immediately started the generator back up and turned on every light we had, flooding the area around our site with harsh white light. "What were those things?" Melissa asked. She was shaking, pressed against the far wall of the living area. "They looked human," Jake said, but his voice was uncertain. "They moved wrong," Sarah said. "Did you see the way that one turned its head? People don't move like that." I was looking out the window, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. Maybe they were just, I don't know, scientists working some kind of night shift. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. Scientists don't stand motionless for minutes at a time. Scientists don't move with that unnatural smoothness. And scientists definitely don't pursue fleeing campers through the woods in complete silence. "We need to leave," Sarah said. "Right now." "It's after midnight," I pointed out. "That Forest Service road is barely wide enough for this thing in daylight. In the dark, I'd rather take my chances with a narrow road than stay here with whatever those things were." She was right, but before I could agree, the lights went out. Not just our lights, everything. The generator coughed once and died, plunging us into absolute darkness. Outside, the forest had gone completely black. Even the stars had disappeared as if something was blocking them out. "Marcus?" Sarah's voice was small and scared. "I'm here." I fumbled for my flashlight, clicked it on. The beam seemed pathetically weak against the darkness pressing in around us. "Everyone stay calm. Jake, can you check the generator?" "Already on it," Jake said. I could hear him moving toward the rear of the RV. A moment later, "It's not responding. Everything looks normal, but it's completely dead. Backup batteries? Should have kicked in automatically, but look." He pointed to the control panel. Every LED that should have been glowing was dark. It's like something drained all the power at once. Outside, the humming had returned. But now, it wasn't coming from one direction. It was all around us, a chorus of electronic voices rising and falling in complex harmonies. And with it came a new sound. Footsteps. Slow, measured footsteps circling our RV. "Don't look outside," I said, though I could already see Sarah moving toward the window. "Sarah, don't—" She pulled back the curtain and immediately staggered backward, her face pale in the flashlight beam. "There are dozens of them," she whispered, just standing there, watching. I couldn't help myself. I moved to another window and peered out through the blinds. The dark figures from the installation were arranged in concentric circles around our RV. They stood perfectly still, their faces turned toward us. In the weak glow of our flashlights, I could see that their eyes reflected light like an animal's. But the reflections were wrong. Too bright, too consistent, more like LED lights than natural eye shine. "They're not human," Melissa said. She was looking out the back window. "Look at their arms." I followed her gaze and felt my stomach drop. The figure's arms hung at their sides, but they were too long, extending past their knees. And their hands. Their hands had too many fingers. "What do they want?" Jake asked. As if in response to his question, one of the figures stepped forward. It raised one of those impossible hands and knocked on our door. 3 slow, deliberate raps that echoed through the RV like gunshots. We all froze, barely breathing. The knocking came again, followed by a voice. "Please, open the door." It was Jake's voice. Exactly Jake's voice, down to the slight rasp he'd developed from years of smoking in college. But Jake was standing right next to me, his mouth hanging open in shock. "We know you're in there," the voice continued, still using Jake's vocal patterns. "We just want to help." Now it was Sarah's voice, warm and concerned. But Sarah was gripping my arm so tightly I could feel her fingernails through my jacket. "There's been an accident," my own voice said from outside. "Your families are worried about you." "Don't listen to it," I whispered, though hearing my own voice speaking words I hadn't said was almost overwhelming. The voices multiplied. Soon there was a chorus of us outside, Jake and Sarah and Melissa and me, all talking at once, pleading and cajoling and demanding that we open the door. They knew things about us, personal things. My voice mentioned the fight Sarah and I had had about buying a house. Sarah's voice brought up Jake's fear of commitment. Jake's voice talked about my recurring nightmares. "How do they know that stuff?" Melissa asked, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know," I said, but I was starting to have a terrible suspicion. The phones, all those missed calls and messages. What if whatever was out there hadn't just been blocking our communications? What if it had been monitoring them, learning from them? "We need to get out of here," Sarah said, "right now." "The engine won't start without the batteries," Jake pointed out. "Then we go on foot." "Through them?" I gestured toward the windows. "They're completely surrounding us." Then we wait for morning. But morning felt like a lifetime away, and I wasn't sure we had that long. The voices outside were becoming more agitated, more demanding. They'd moved on from pleading to threats, though the threats were delivered in our own voices, which made them infinitely more disturbing. "If you don't open this door," my voice said, "we're going to have to break it down." "Please," Sarah's voice added. "We're running out of patience." The first impact against the door came 5 minutes later, a hollow boom that made the entire RV shake. Then another and another. Whatever was hitting the door was strong enough to dent the reinforced steel. "The emergency exit," Jake said suddenly. "In the bedroom. There's a window that opens wide enough to climb through." We made our way to the back of the RV, trying to move quietly despite the pounding on the front door. The emergency window was above the bed, secured with a simple latch. I opened it as quietly as possible and peered out. The back of the RV faced the forest, and I could see figures moving between the trees. More of those impossible silhouettes with their 2 long arms and glowing eyes. But they seemed focused on the front of the RV, drawn by the sound of their companions trying to break down the door. "There's a gap," I whispered. "Maybe 20 yards to the tree line. If we're fast." "Where do we go once we're in the trees?" Melissa asked. "The road," Sarah said. "If we can make it back to the main Forest Service road, maybe we can flag down another camper. Or hike out." It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all we had. The pounding on the front door was getting stronger, and I could hear metal beginning to groan and buckle. I went first, dropping from the window to the soft forest floor and immediately rolling behind a nearby tree. The figures in the forest had their backs to me, still focused on whatever was happening at the front of the RV. Sarah came next, then Melissa, then Jake. We crouched in the shadows, hearts pounding while the sounds of destruction continued from the other side of the RV. "Now," I whispered. We ran. The forest was a nightmare maze of fallen logs and low branches, made worse by the fact that we were running without flashlights, trying to navigate by starlight alone. Behind us, I could hear shouts, our own voices calling out in anger and frustration as they discovered our escape. But we were faster than our pursuers. Whatever those things were, they weren't built for running through rough terrain. We crashed through the underbrush, branches tearing at our clothes and faces, until we reached the narrow gravel road that led back toward the main Forest Service route. "Which way?" Jake gasped. I tried to orient myself, but in the dark, everything looked the same. The road curved away in both directions, disappearing into identical walls of trees. "Left," Sarah said. "I think we came from the left." We jogged down the middle of the road, our footsteps crunching on the gravel. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, we reached the junction with the main Forest Service road. The wider road was a relief. It meant civilization, meant a way out. "We did it," Melissa said, breathing hard. "We actually—" That's when we saw the RV. It was parked in Site 7 of Pine Ridge Campground, exactly where we'd left it. The generator was humming quietly, and warm light spilled from the windows. "That's impossible," Jake said. "We ran for half an hour. We're miles from the campground." But there it was, our temporary home looking perfectly normal and inviting. As we watched, a figure moved past one of the windows, a human silhouette that could have been any one of us. "It's them," Sarah breathed. "They're in our RV." But how did they get it here? And how are we here? I looked back the way we'd come. The Forest Service road stretched away into darkness, just as it had when we'd driven in earlier. But that was impossible. We'd been running away from the campground, not in a circle. "The road," I said slowly. "It's the same road." "What do you mean?" "I mean there might not be another road. There might not be a way out." We stood there in the dark, staring at our stolen RV, trying to process what was happening. The electronic humming had returned, seeming to come from everywhere at once, and in the distance I could see more lights through the trees, the blue-green glow of that installation, which should have been miles behind us. "We're trapped," Sarah said. "No." I grabbed her hand. "There has to be an explanation. Some kind of optical illusion, or magnetic anomaly, or—" But even as I said it, I knew I was grasping at straws. Whatever was happening here went beyond any natural phenomenon I could imagine. "The lake," Jake said suddenly. "Remember? Mirror Lake. It was supposed to be north of here. What about it? What if it's not just a lake? What if it's, I don't know, some kind of dimensional boundary? A place where normal rules don't apply?" It sounded crazy, but so did everything else that had happened tonight. And we needed a destination. A plan that didn't involve walking in circles on roads that led nowhere. "Okay," I said. "We try to find this lake, but first we need supplies." The RV looked peaceful from the outside, but we could see shadows moving behind the curtains, the things that had taken our place, using our voices, living our lives. The generator was running, which meant they'd figured out how to restore power. They'd made themselves at home. "How do we get our stuff back?" Melissa asked. "We don't," Sarah said. "We make do with what we have." What we had wasn't much. The clothes on our backs, Jake's lighter, and the small LED flashlight I'd grabbed during our escape. But we also had each other, and that had to be enough. We left the road and plunged back into the forest, this time heading due north according to Jake's compass app, the one function on our phones that still seemed to work. The terrain was rougher away from the established trails, full of deadfall and steep ravines that forced us to detour constantly. After an hour of hiking, we found water, a small stream that bubbled over moss-covered rocks. We followed it upstream, hoping it would lead to the lake Jake had mentioned. The sound of running water was comforting after the oppressive silence of the deeper forest, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I started to feel a glimmer of hope. That's when Sarah disappeared. One moment she was walking beside me, her hand in mine, and the next she was simply gone. I turned around to ask Jake something and realized I was holding empty air. "Sarah?" I called out, but my voice seemed to be absorbed by the trees before it could travel more than a few feet. "Where is she?" Melissa asked. She and Jake had caught up to me, both of them looking around frantically. "She was right here," I said. She was holding my hand and then... "Sarah!" Jake shouted, cupping his hands around his mouth. "Sarah!" No response. The forest had swallowed her as completely as if she'd never existed. "We have to find her," I said, already starting back the way we'd come. "Marcus, wait." Jake grabbed my arm. "What if this is what they want? What if they're picking us off one by one? I don't care. I'm not leaving her." But after 2 hours of searching, calling her name until our voices were hoarse, we had to face the possibility that she was gone. Really gone, in a way that had nothing to do with getting lost in the woods. "We keep going," Melissa said quietly. Sarah would want us to keep going. I wanted to argue, to keep searching, but I knew she was right. And standing still in these woods felt like an invitation for whatever had taken Sarah to come back for the rest of us. We found Mirror Lake just before dawn. It was smaller than I'd expected, maybe 100 yards across, perfectly circular, and so still it looked like black glass. The trees around its perimeter were different from the rest of the forest, older, more gnarled, with bark that seemed to writhe in the early morning light. "There," Jake said, pointing to the far shore. "Do you see it?" I followed his gaze and felt my blood turn to ice. Sarah was standing on the opposite side of the lake, perfectly motionless, facing the water. Even at a distance, something looked wrong about her posture, the way she held her head. "Sarah!" I shouted, starting around the lake toward her. She turned at the sound of my voice, and I stumbled to a halt. It was Sarah's face, Sarah's hair, Sarah's clothes, but her eyes were wrong. Too bright, too reflective, just like the creatures that had surrounded our RV. "Marcus!" she called back, and her voice was exactly right, warm and familiar and full of relief. "Thank God you found me. I've been so scared." But she didn't move toward us. She stood there by the water's edge, smiling a smile that was just slightly too wide. "Something happened to her," Melissa whispered. "Or something's wearing her," Jake added. The thing that looked like Sarah continued to call out to us, pleading for us to come around the lake, to help her, to hold her. It knew things only Sarah would know, about our first date, about the scar on my shoulder from a childhood accident, about the night she'd told me she loved me for the first time. But it didn't know about the fight we'd had 3 days ago, the one that had made her cry in the hotel bathroom while she thought I was asleep. The real Sarah would have mentioned that fight, would have used it to prove she was really herself. "It's not her," I said, the words feeling like broken glass in my throat. "Are you sure?" Melissa asked. I wasn't sure of anything anymore, but I was sure that whatever was standing on the far shore, it wasn't the woman I'd planned to marry. As we watched, more figures emerged from the trees behind not Sarah. Jake, Melissa, and myself, all standing with that same unnatural stillness, all wearing those same 2 bright smiles. "We need to leave," Jake said. "Right now." But as we turned to go, we found our own duplicates blocking the path behind us. Perfect copies down to the smallest detail, but with those glowing eyes and wrong smiles. "Hello," my duplicate said in my exact voice. "We've been waiting for you." We were surrounded, trapped between the lake and the things that wore our faces. But something about the lake itself drew my attention, the way the surface rippled despite the complete absence of wind, the way reflections seemed to move independently of their sources. "The lake," I said suddenly. "Jake, your guidebook, where did you really find it?" "I told you, I can't remember." Jake started, then stopped. His face went pale. Oh, God. I found it here, in the RV, when we first arrived. It was just sitting on the table. A guidebook that mentioned a lake that doesn't exist on any map. It exists, Not Sarah said from across the water. Mirror Lake reflects all possibilities. Past, present, future, real, unreal. It doesn't matter here. You're from the lake, I said, understanding beginning to dawn. You're reflections that learn to exist independently. We're improvements, Not Me said. Perfect copies of imperfect originals. Your families will never know the difference. They'll be happier this way. The electronic humming filled the air again, and I realized it was coming from the lake itself. Some kind of signal or beacon that had drawn us here. The installation in the forest, the broken GPS, the strange behavior of our phones. It had all been designed to bring us to this place. What did you do with Sarah? I demanded. She's safe, Not Sarah said. She's part of the lake now, part of all the reflections. She'll exist forever, in every possible version of herself. That's not living, Melissa said. That's just existing. What's the difference? Not Jake asked. In the end, what's the difference between a perfect copy and the original? I didn't have an answer for that. But I knew I wasn't going to find out by standing here debating philosophy with things that weren't really human. The surface of Mirror Lake was starting to glow with that same blue-green light we'd seen at the installation. Something was rising from its depths. A shape that hurt to look at directly, all angles and curves that didn't make sense in three-dimensional space. It's beautiful, isn't it? Not Sarah said. The source of all reflections. The place where possibilities become real. Marcus, Jake whispered. The trees. Look at the trees. I followed his gaze and saw what he meant. The gnarled trees around the lake's perimeter weren't rooted in the ground. They were growing downward from the sky, their branches reaching toward the earth like twisted fingers. And beyond them, the forest itself was beginning to shift and change. Trees flowing like water, the ground rippling like fabric in the wind. Reality was breaking down around Mirror Lake, and we were at the center of the collapse. We have to run, I said. Where? Melissa asked. There's nowhere to go. She was right. The duplicates blocked every path, and behind them, Story 5. The static started 3 hours into our drive, crackling through the RV's radio like something trying to claw its way out. My name is Marcus Reed. I'm 34 years old, and what happened during our weekend trip to the Uinta Mountains still makes me check my rearview mirror every night, expecting to see headlights that shouldn't be there. It was supposed to be simple. A long weekend in our new Winnebago with my wife Sarah and our friends Tom and Jessica Chen. Tom had been pushing for this trip for months, ever since he'd bought the damn thing. Come on, Marcus, he'd said, grinning like a kid with a new toy. What's the point of having a house on wheels if we don't take it somewhere remote? Remote. That word should have been our first warning. The Uinta Mountains in northeastern Utah stretched before us like a wall of green and granite, beautiful and indifferent. We'd driven Highway 150 before in cars, but never in Tom's 36-foot beast of an RV. The narrow mountain road twisted through dense stands of aspen and pine, climbing steadily toward Mirror Lake. Turn that off, Sarah said from the passenger seat, gesturing at the radio. The static had gotten worse, punctuated now by what sounded almost like voices, distant, distorted, speaking words just beyond comprehension. I reached for the dial, but Tom's voice crackled through the intercom from the driver's seat. Leave it. Sometimes you pick up weird signals in the mountains. CB radio maybe, or truckers on the interstate. But we were 40 miles from any interstate. Jessica laughed nervously from the dinette behind us. She was Tom's wife of 8 years, a petite woman with nervous energy who worked as a graphic designer. It sounds like aliens trying to phone home. More like something trying to phone us, Sarah muttered. She was 32, a nurse at Primary Children's Hospital, practical and unflappable. If she was bothered by something, it was worth paying attention to. The static suddenly cut out, replaced by crystal-clear silence that felt heavier than the interference. Outside, the afternoon sun slanted through the trees, casting long shadows that seemed to reach toward our slow-moving RV like grasping fingers. Tom had been my best friend since college, where we'd bonded over late-night philosophy discussions and a shared love of craft beer. He was the kind of guy who planned everything down to the last detail, which made his next words all the more unsettling. "I think we missed our turn," he said. I looked out at the GPS mounted on the dashboard. The screen showed our blue dot crawling along a gray line, but the line seemed to extend far beyond where Highway 150 should have ended. The lake we were heading for, Mirror Lake, our planned campground, wasn't even visible on the current zoom level. "That can't be right," I said, studying the display. "We should have reached the lake an hour ago." Tom slowed the RV to a stop in the middle of the road. There was no other traffic, hadn't been for the last 2 hours. He climbed down from the driver's seat and walked to where Sarah and I sat at the small table. "Look at this," he said, pointing at the GPS. The screen now showed nothing but gray, with our position marker blinking alone in an empty void. It was working fine this morning. Jessica joined us, her face pale. "My phone has no signal. Like not even one bar." I checked mine. Same thing. Sarah's, too. 4 phones, 4 different carriers, all dead. "Maybe it's the altitude," Sarah suggested, but her voice lacked conviction. We'd been camping in mountains before. This felt different. Outside, the forest had grown eerily quiet. No bird songs, no rustling leaves, no insect hum. Just the idle rumble of the RV's engine and the faint whistle of wind through the trees. Tom returned to the driver's seat. "Well, we can't just sit here. Road has to lead somewhere." He put the RV back in drive, and we continued deeper into the mountains. The aspen groves gave way to darker stands of spruce and fir, their branches so thick they formed a canopy that blocked most of the remaining daylight. The temperature had dropped noticeably, and I could see our breath fogging when we spoke. That's when we saw the first sign. It wasn't a road sign or campground marker. It was a piece of torn yellow fabric tied to a pine branch, fluttering like a desperate wave. As we passed, I noticed more. Scraps of cloth in different colors, some fresh, others faded by weather and time, all tied at eye level along the roadside. "What the hell are those?" Jessica whispered. None of us had an answer. The road began to narrow, branches scraping against the RV's sides with fingernail sounds that made us all wince. Tom should have turned around, but the road was too narrow now, the trees too close. We were committed to following it wherever it led. The GPS screen flickered and suddenly displayed a message. "Recalculating route." "Well, that's encouraging," Tom said, but his knuckles were white on the steering wheel. The recalculation seemed to take forever, the screen cycling through loading bars and error messages. Finally, it settled on a new display that made my blood run cold. Instead of our familiar blue dot, there were now 4 red dots clustered together, and they were moving along a road that definitely wasn't on any official map. More disturbing was what the GPS labeled our destination. Haven Creek Campground, established 1962, permanently closed. "Why would a permanently closed campground still be on GPS?" Sarah asked. "Maybe it's old data," I offered, but even I didn't believe it. The road suddenly opened into a small clearing, and Tom brought the RV to a grateful stop. We all stepped outside, eager to stretch our legs and get our bearings. The air was cold enough to numb our faces, and the silence was so complete it felt oppressive. The clearing was maybe 50 feet across, surrounded by towering pines that seemed to lean inward like they were listening. In the center stood a weathered wooden sign, its paint peeling and letters barely legible. Haven Creek Campground, elevation, 9,847 feet. Below that, in fresher paint, no overnight camping, authorized personnel only. "Authorized by whom?" Jessica asked. Tom walked to the sign and examined it closely. "This is weird. Look at the dates." He pointed to the bottom corner where small text read, EST, 1962, closed 1963. "A campground that was only open for 1 year," Sarah said. "That's not normal." I was studying the surrounding forest when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The trees at the edge of the clearing were marked with symbols, not natural growth patterns or axe marks, but deliberate carvings. They formed a rough circle around the entire clearing, each symbol about head high and precisely cut into the bark. "Hey!" I called to the others. "Come look at this." They gathered around the nearest tree. The symbol was complex, geometric, like something between a star and a spider web, with lines that seemed to twist in ways that hurt to follow with your eyes. "That's not random," Jessica said. She was backing away from the tree, her designer instincts recognizing intentional design. "Someone carved these. Recently." Tom had walked to another tree. "They're all the same," he called. Every tree around the clearing. The sun was setting rapidly, the mountain air growing bitter cold. We needed to make a decision. Stay here for the night or risk driving in darkness on roads that weren't supposed to exist. "We should keep going," Sarah said. "Find a real campground." But as Tom climbed back into the RV and turned the key, nothing happened. The engine turned over once, twice, then died completely. He tried again. The starter clicked pathetically. "Battery's dead," he said, disbelief in his voice. "That's impossible. It's brand new." I helped him pop the hood. The battery terminals were corroded, covered in a white, crystalline growth that definitely hadn't been there that morning. More disturbing, the corrosion formed patterns. Not random oxidation, but deliberate shapes that reminded me uncomfortably of the symbols on the trees. "This doesn't make sense," Tom said, prodding at the corrosion with a screwdriver. It flaked away like dried salt, but underneath, the metal was eaten away completely. Jessica appeared at my elbow. "Marcus, look at this." She was holding one of the fabric scraps we'd seen tied to trees along the road. Up close, I could see it was torn from a jacket, expensive outdoor gear the kind serious hikers wore. "There are more," she said, pointing into the forest. "Lots more." Indeed, now that we were looking for them, the colored scraps were everywhere, tied to branches, caught on thorns, scattered on the ground like a trail of breadcrumbs. But unlike Hansel and Gretel's story, these breadcrumbs led deeper into the dark woods, not home. The temperature was dropping fast. We had no choice but to spend the night. Tom started the RV's generator and the lights came on, pushing back the gathering darkness. We made dinner, canned soup and sandwiches, but none of us had much appetite. Every few minutes, one of us would glance out the windows at the tree line, where the symbols seemed to move and shift in the peripheral vision. "I keep feeling like we're being watched," Jessica said. "By who?" Tom asked. "We haven't seen another person all day." But he was wrong. As if summoned by his words, a figure emerged from the tree line. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing what looked like a park ranger's uniform. He walked directly toward our RV with deliberate steps, never looking left or right. There was something off about his gait, too measured, too precise, like someone concentrating very hard on appearing normal. Tom met him at the door. "Evening, officer. We're having some engine trouble." The ranger smiled, but it was the wrong kind of smile. Too wide, held too long. "Engine trouble. Yes, that happens here. Often." His voice was pleasant, conversational, but there was something underneath it, like an echo of itself. "I'm Ranger Peterson," he continued. "I monitor this area. Make sure people are safe." "We were trying to get to Mirror Lake," Sarah said from behind Tom. "Our GPS seems to be malfunctioning." "Mirror Lake?" The ranger's smile widened impossibly. "Yes, many people try to reach Mirror Lake. Very few succeed." "What do you mean?" I asked. Instead of answering, Ranger Peterson walked to one of the marked trees and placed his hand flat against the carved symbol. "These are old," he said. "From before the closure. From before we understood what was happening here." "What was happening here?" Tom demanded. The ranger turned back to us, and in the RV's exterior lights I could see his face clearly for the first time. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes reflected light like an animal's. Most disturbing of all, when he smiled, I could see that his teeth extended too far back into his mouth, row after row of them like a shark's. "People got lost," he said simply. They came looking for Mirror Lake, for campgrounds that showed up on their maps, and they got lost. Some of them are still here, still looking. Jessica grabbed my arm. "Marcus," she whispered urgently. I followed her gaze to the tree line, where more figures had appeared. A dozen of them, maybe more, all wearing the same ranger uniform, all standing perfectly still among the trees. In the dim light, I could make out their faces, pale, smiling, wrong. The campground was closed in 1963, Ranger Peterson continued, as if giving a rehearsed speech. After 17 campers disappeared over the course of one summer. They found the campground 3 days after the last group was reported missing. All the tents were still there, food still warm on the camp stoves, but no people. He gestured to the fabric scraps scattered throughout the clearing. These belonged to some of them, the ones who tried to mark their way out. "This is insane," Tom said, but his voice shook. "You're rangers. Help us get out of here." "Oh, we'll help," Peterson said. "We've been helping for 60 years. All the lost campers, all the people whose GPS led them astray, all the ones who took the wrong turn and found themselves here instead of Mirror Lake. We helped them understand." The figures at the tree line began to move, walking toward us with that same measured, unnatural gait. As they got closer, I could see that some of their uniforms were decades old, faded and torn. Others looked fresh, new. "Understand what?" Sarah asked. "That some places aren't meant for the living," Peterson said. "That some roads lead to destinations that exist between what is and what was. Haven Creek Campground was built on one of those places. A thin spot, a crossing. The other rangers, if that's what they were, had formed a loose circle around our RV. Their smiles never wavered, but their eyes held a hunger that made my stomach turn. The symbols on the trees," Peterson continued. "They mark the boundary. Nothing living can cross them. Nothing dead can leave. It's a perfect arrangement." I understood then, with the clarity that comes from absolute terror. "You're not rangers." "We were," Peterson said. "I came here in the summer of '68, investigating reports of missing hikers. My partner Jake there," he pointed to one of the figures, "he came in '72. Linda was 81. Dave was last year. Last year. I thought about the fresh symbols, the new-looking uniform on one of the figures. "People keep coming," Peterson said. "GPS glitches, wrong turns, equipment failures that lead them right to us. It's almost like the place calls to them." The RV's generator coughed and died, plunging us into darkness. In the silence that followed, I could hear them breathing. Not the breathing of living people, but something else, like wind through dry leaves. Tom fumbled for the emergency flashlight, clicking it on. The beam illuminated Peterson's face, still wearing that impossible smile. "Your battery will be fine in the morning," Peterson said. "Runs like new, every time. Of course, by then you'll understand that there's nowhere to go." The beam of the flashlight wavered as Tom's hand shook. "What do you want from us?" "Company," Peterson said simply. "It gets lonely out here. Lonely and cold and dark. But when people join us, it's better. Much better." One of the other rangers, a woman in a uniform from the 1980s, stepped forward. Her voice was like rustling paper. "The crossing happens at midnight, when the boundary is thinnest. It's easier then, less traumatic." I checked my watch. 11:47 p.m. "We need to run," I whispered to the others. "Where?" Jessica hissed back. "They're everywhere." She was right. The rangers had completely surrounded us, standing just outside the circle of trees, just beyond the carved symbols, waiting. "The symbols," I said suddenly. "Peterson said nothing living can cross them. Nothing dead can leave. We're inside the circle. They can't come in." "But we can't leave either," Sarah pointed out. Tom was examining the nearest tree, shining his flashlight on the carved symbol. "What if we damage them? Broke the circle?" "Don't." Peterson's voice carried clearly across the clearing, though he hadn't raised it. "The symbols don't just mark the boundary. They maintain it. Break them, and everything held back for 60 years comes through at once. I didn't want to know what he meant by that, but I could imagine. 60 years of missing people. 60 years of whatever force had transformed these rangers into something else, all contained by geometric cuts in tree bark. 11:52 p.m. The air in the clearing began to change, growing thicker, harder to breathe. The temperature plummeted until our breath came out in thick clouds. The rangers stood motionless in the growing cold, unaffected. "I can feel it," Jessica whispered. "Something's coming." The ground beneath our feet started to vibrate, a low thrumming that seemed to come from deep underground. The carved symbols on the trees began to glow with a faint, sickly light that made them stand out starkly against the dark bark. 11:57 p.m. "There has to be another way," Tom said desperately. He was examining the RV's engine compartment again, scraping at the corroded battery terminals with his keys. Some way out. That's when I noticed something Peterson had said earlier. The battery would be fine in the morning. Not because the RV would be repaired, but because they expected us to still be here. Expected us to have joined them. But what if we weren't here when morning came? I grabbed the emergency road flares from the RV's safety kit. Military surplus, the kind that burned hot enough to cut through metal. If Peterson was right about the symbols maintaining some kind of barrier, maybe destroying one would... "Marcus!" "No." Sarah grabbed my arm as I headed for the nearest tree. "You heard what he said." 11:59 p.m. The thrumming from underground was getting stronger, and I could swear I heard voices in it. Dozens of voices, maybe hundreds, all calling out from somewhere far below the earth. The missing campers from 1963, and all the others who'd found their way here over the decades. The rangers were getting closer, somehow managing to take steps forward without appearing to move. Their smiles had grown wider, showing more and more of those impossible rows of teeth. Peterson raised one hand, and they all stopped. 30 seconds, he said. Then the boundary opens and you become part of Haven Creek. Part of us. It's not so bad, really. The hunger fades after the first few years. I made my decision. Igniting the flare with one sharp pull, I lunged toward the nearest tree. The road flare hissed and sparked, throwing wild shadows that made the rangers' faces look even more inhuman. I pressed the burning magnesium against the carved symbol, and the effect was immediate and terrifying. The symbol didn't just burn away, it screamed. A high, piercing sound that seemed to come from the tree itself, from the earth below, from the air around us. The sickly glow from all the other symbols flared brighter, pulsing in rhythm with something that felt like a massive heartbeat. And then the boundary broke. The change was like a dam bursting. The air rushed out of the clearing with a sound like a hurricane, and something else rushed in to take its place. Something that made the hair on our arms stand up and our teeth ache. The ground cracked and shifted, and through the cracks came a smell like old graves and rotting flowers. The rangers scattered, their measured composure finally broken. Peterson spun toward me, his face contorting with rage, and I saw that behind those rows of teeth was nothing but darkness. No throat, no tongue, just a void that seemed to pull at my vision. "You have no idea what you've done," he snarled, his pleasant voice replaced by something like the screaming wind. But I wasn't looking at him anymore. I was looking at what was rising from the cracks in the ground. Hands. Dozens of pale reaching hands pushing up through the earth like some horrible crop. Behind them came arms, shoulders, faces, all the people who'd been taken by this place over the decades. Not dead, but not alive either. Something caught between states and held in the earth by the symbol's power. They pulled themselves out of the ground with desperate, grasping motions, and the first thing they did was turn toward the rangers with expressions of pure fury. "Run!" I shouted to the others. We sprinted toward the RV, but the engine was still dead, the battery still corroded. Tom frantically turned the key while the battle erupted around us. The trapped souls of decades of missing people finally free to confront their captors. The rangers fought back, their human facades dropping completely to reveal something that might once have been people but had been transformed into something else. Something that fed on the lost and dying. Their movements were too fast, too fluid. like they were made of smoke and malice instead of flesh and bone. But there were so many more of the freed souls, and they had 60 years of rage to fuel them. 12:03 a.m. In the chaos, I saw our chance. The battle had carried most of the combatants away from the RV, leaving a clear path to the road. But we needed power. "The generator!" I yelled to Tom. "Start the generator!" He understood immediately. If we couldn't get the main engine running, maybe we could at least get the lights and electrical systems back online. The generator kicked over on the first try, flooding the clearing with brilliant white light that made both the Rangers and the freed souls recoil. More importantly, it powered up the GPS. The screen flickered to life, showing our position as a red dot in the middle of what the device labeled as unmapped territory. But now there was a route displayed, a thin blue line leading away from our current location. "Northwest," I told Tom. "Quarter mile, then it connects back to Highway 150. But the engine." "Forget the engine. We roll." Tom understood. Haven Creek Campground sat on a slope, slight but noticeable. With the RV's brakes off and the transmission in neutral, gravity would do the work. He released the parking brake, and the 36-foot Winnebago began to roll, slowly at first, then picking up speed as the slight downgrade pulled us toward the tree line. Behind us, the battle raged on. Through the rear window, I could see Peterson wrestling with what looked like a park ranger from the 1970s, both of them moving in ways that defied physics. Other figures, both the false rangers and the freed souls, flickered in and out of existence like bad television reception. The RV broke through the circle of marked trees, and I felt something snap, like an invisible chain breaking. Suddenly, the air was easier to breathe. The oppressive weight lifted from our chests. We rolled through the dark forest, steering around trees by the light of the still-functioning headlights, following the blue line on the GPS that led us back toward the world of the living. Every few hundred yards, Tom would tap the brakes to keep our speed manageable, but mostly we just let gravity carry us away from that cursed clearing. It took 45 minutes of rolling downhill through increasingly familiar-looking terrain before we reached Highway 150. Real Highway 150, not the impossible extension that had led us to Haven Creek. Tom managed to get the engine started. The battery terminals were clean now, like new, and we drove straight through the night, not stopping until we reached the lights of Evanston, Wyoming. We never talked about what happened that night. Not really. We filed a report with the local sheriff's department about getting lost, but we didn't mention the Rangers or the symbols or the hands coming up through the ground. Who would believe it? But sometimes, late at night, I find myself researching Haven Creek Campground online. There are mentions of it in old newspaper archives, the missing hikers from 1963, the closure, the occasional search and rescue operations for people whose GPS led them astray in the Uinta Mountains. What bothers me most is that the reports never stopped. Even after we escaped, people still go missing in that area. Campers whose GPS malfunctions, hikers who take wrong turns, RV enthusiasts who follow roads that shouldn't exist. They're still out there, Peterson and his kind, waiting for the boundary to be rebuilt, for the symbols to be carved again, for new people to join their permanent staff at a campground that was closed 60 years ago. And sometimes, when I'm driving alone at night and my GPS glitches, showing me routes that don't make sense, I wonder if they're calling to me, if that thin place between what is and what was is trying to pull me back. The static started again last week, crackling through my car radio as I drove home from work. For just a moment, I could swear I heard Peterson's voice, pleasant and conversational. Many people try to reach Mirror Lake, very few succeed. I turned off the radio and drove straight home, checking my rearview mirror the whole way. But I can still hear it sometimes, in the quiet moments between sleep and waking. The sound of something scratching at my door, patient and persistent, waiting for me to let it in.